Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and as you know, we have been talking about the pyramids and most importantly the sort of new mega structures that allegedly have been found underneath a lot on this channel lately. Here are a few of the videos that I made, but by the way, this one didn't get a lot of views and I think it's really worth it. You should check it out. It debunks quite a few myths that have been spreading around. You'll find a link in the description. But the one I want to focus on is this one here. Did I figure out what's under the pyramids of Giza? Giza. Can't even pronounce it. What am I going to figure out? Can't even pronounce it. Anyways, during this video, I proposed an idea. Rather than going for the more, shall we say, sci-fi explanations on what these scans could mean, I decided to come up with an hypothesis that would be based on what we know that ancient people were doing, aka mining shafts. Now, given it is not a perfect explanation, I understand that. In fact, maybe it shouldn't even be called a hypothesis. Maybe it's just an idea put out there. Still, is not as silly of an idea as you might think. Now, of course, even though Filippo Biondi, who is the main scientist behind this whole discovery, said that he's 90% confident in the results of the scans, the interpretation presented by, for example, Corrado Malanga, to me, just doesn't sound possible. And as I was saying, I am inclined to believe that perhaps Biondi did find something. I just don't think that the explanation presented by Corrado Malanga is fit and reliable. In fact, even realistic. However, if time passes and they do confirm that yes, there is something underneath the pyramid, I think the idea for the mines is not as silly as you might think. And when I say you, I mean this. Quite a few comments were left by some of you viewers underneath that video where you were sort of countering my idea when it comes to these mines. Now, some are very professional, like this one here. Others are more on the mocking type. Some are even accusatory in nature. Yeah. Still, if I had to summarize all of these comments, I would say that the sort of counter-arguments that have been presented have to do with four main arguments: the water issue, the temperature issue, the oxygen issue, and the lighting issue. I would like to now address and respond and possibly resolve all of these issues. But do keep in mind that this is not me trying to absolutely defend my idea. No, I might still be wrong. But what I do notice when it comes to a lot of these comments is that the people that are rejecting this idea a priori are not really familiar with how mining operations worked both in classical antiquity, Bronze Age, Iron Age, etc. Because a lot of these problems were absolutely dealt with and even solved by, for example, the ancient Romans and the Greeks. Also, there is a plot twist. We'll see that in a minute. The water issue. If there is an underground water stream, no ancient mining operation could be conducted, as the galleries and shafts would get flooded. The temperature issue. As you keep digging underground, the temperature increases and eventually reaches a point where no human could survive, let alone work and extract material. The oxygen issue. Once reached a certain depth, airflow is interrupted, ventilation becomes a problem, oxygen is not available, and workers would die. The lighting issue. If you go deep enough, you wouldn't get any sunlight and you can't use torches down there, so workers would have to mine in darkness. We are in the ancient Egyptian context, but I do have to be able to speak about other people as well, because we have to use the most documented ones we have in order to start building up a little bit of a hypothesis defense. Let's focus for a moment onto the ancient Romans, as they have left us a lot of documentation on how they conducted their mining operations. Finding metal ore deposits and transforming them into mines was indeed a major focus of the ancient Roman Republic and later of the Empire. In fact, we could say that the search and acquisition of metal ore was so important in ancient Rome that it affected both foreign policy and defined international relationships. Metal is a very broad topic, it's a massive umbrella term, so let's at least divide it into two categories: strategic metals, such as iron, copper, tin, and lead, and precious metals, such as gold and silver. Now, of course, before we even talk about what sort of mines and how they produced them and what the operations looked like, we have to describe how the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks managed to, first of all, locate a deposit with mineable veins. Obviously, they did not have access to modern technology. Still, the ancients were extremely resourceful and very methodical, and they did have a highly documented system for finding raw material. Regardless of the fact that Romans and Greeks didn't have a structured theoretical understanding of geology as we do today, they made useful observations that helped them find metal ore with an incredible degree of success. Pliny, Roman author and naturalist, noted in his writings that certain types of soil or earth were associated with specific ores. This shows that the ancients were able to recognize patterns in order to locate where valuable minerals could be found. It is by going deeply into the sources that we can identify at least 4 specific techniques that were used by the ancients to locate said materials: placer deposit tracing, metal affinities, layer contacts, and adits for prospecting. Placer deposits are concentrations of valuable materials, like gold for example, that have been moved by water and deposited in streams or riverbeds. The Romans would follow these deposits upstream to find the source, a smart prospecting technique. When it comes to metal affinities, the Romans noticed that certain metals tend to be found together, what we now understand as related elements often occurring in the same geological formation. Layer contact. The Romans and the Greeks observed that metals were often found at the boundaries where different rock or soil layers met, what modern geologists would call geological interfaces or contact zones. Lastly, adits are horizontal tunnels dug into hillsides. The Romans used these in a limited way for exploration purposes, as noted by Diodorus. Now, we do know that one of the characteristics that moved the Romans to investing manpower and resources into extraction of certain materials from the raw deposits had to do with the strategic and tactical importance of said materials. See, for example, tin and copper in order to be able to produce bronze, iron in order to be able to produce wrought iron and steel for their weapons, and then of course gold and silver for obvious monetary gain and profit. Tin, for instance, was one of the reasons why Julius Caesar decided to try and invade Britain in the first place, and why Claudius continued the endeavor. And even though tin and iron may make the Romans invade a land or even put their men on a ship and navigate to a different country, gold and silver would be the type of metal that the Romans were ready to go full in to gain. When it comes to gold, the Romans tell us that there were 3 ways in which they would acquire it. Either the easiest one, river stream deposits, and they say that that was the most refined one. The second possibility was to extract it from mountain debris. But the third, and usually most difficult one, was to mine it in underground shafts, which connects with my theory when it comes to the ancient Egyptians. Now, ancient Roman mines are fascinating, because when they have to go underground, usually they would begin to dig vertically. So if you were to look at them from the side, you would exactly see that. They would see perhaps a sort of cylindrical shaft that goes down and it's empty inside as they proceed to go underground. And sometimes some of these shafts can go down as far as 200 meters under the ground. The ones under the pyramids go down to 648 meters. Of course, that would be unheard of when it comes to looking at the ancient period, but that makes me want it to be real even more, because then it would help us rewrite what we know about ancient technology in connection with mining operations. Still, what the Romans would do is that as they continue to dig deeply vertically, the moment they would run into some metal and precious metal, then they would start digging horizontally, creating a little bit of a tunnel. Now, these were oftentimes very small, so you couldn't stand up inside of one of these, and oftentimes the workers had to extract the material with their pickaxes as they were laying down. Not very comfortable. Still, what's interesting about all of this situation is how they handled all of those problems that were brought up by my comments section: water, temperature, oxygen, and lighting. Because, yeah, even if you go down to just 200 meters, you would still find all of these problems. So how did the Romans address them? And why does it matter when we are discussing the Egyptians? Well, before I answer each and every single one of them, I'm going to give you the plot twist right now. So, plot twist. The way the Romans learned how to handle the water issue was something that they learned from the Greeks, but the Greeks themselves learned from the Egyptians. When it comes to water, we know that drainage wheels were used, and also the Romans created a system to divert underground rivers the moment they would notice that they would need to dig through one, as they were obviously aware of the fact that it would flood the entirety of the shaft. Now, for those of you who want to have even more details than what I'm about to present, I'm going to leave 3 links in the description. Link number 1 will connect you to this interesting study called Roman Mining and Quarrying Techniques and the Reuse of Mines. It's very detailed, so I think you're going to like it. But if you want something really for a pro, then I would suggest this Roman mining and metal production near the antique city of Ulpiana in Kosovo, which is a 450 pages PhD thesis entirely dedicated to mining in ancient Rome. And I've been studying it deeply because I'm extremely interested, but once again, it's almost 500 pages, so there is that. However, for today, what I want to look at is this page presented by Earth Science Australia because it's concise, but it's extremely articulate and full of details and will help us answer in a proficient and professional way and resolve some of these issues through the usage of the sources. For instance, if we click on the drainage section, we see how the ancient Romans dealt with underground mining when encountering rivers and water tables specifically, and we read: the control of underground water could determine the viability of a mine. This water comes from percolation from above the mine, or more rarely, from digging into the sea or a subterranean river. Many mines simply stopped at the water table. Mines that went below quickly filled with water when abandoned. While they were being worked, the Romans used several methods for handling the water. So already up to this point, we can see that the problem, the issue that was presented by some of the commentators is absolutely viable. Yes, a water table, and in fact even underground rivers, are a problem when you run into them in the middle of digging and mining for mineral extraction. But they didn't give up. The ancients in fact figured out highly complex ways to deal with the problem. For instance, as we read, they could drive drainage adits below working levels, use slaves to bail the workings, or employ one of 2 mechanical devices. Diodorus states that, open quotes, at a depth they sometimes break in on rivers flowing beneath the surface, whose strength they overcome by diverting their welling tributaries off to the side in the channels, close quotes. So the ancients were absolutely capable of doing that. Occasionally water could be diverted into a natural fissure, but the miners drove artificial channels as well. Drainage adits, also called crosscuts, are found at some sites, and then it gives you the sites. As we continue, water drained from the upper workings into the adit, but during the digging of the adit, the water had to be handled by another method. When the flow was not strong and labor was available, bailing could control the water. Pliny tells of Hannibal using a line of water bearers along a 2.2 kilometers gallery, and I would like to underline, imagine creating that very gallery using only iron and bronze tools. Also, before we continue, don't forget that I make my own rings, Ring of the Noble One. So don't be a muppet, link in the description, get yours today. Bronze, silver, gold and platinum available. If you're a little bit on a budget, the bronze one is the cheapest, of course. Thank you so much, back to the video. And in fact, one of the things that we might look today is how they did it, because often we imagine the pickaxes, which is absolutely something that they used, but another instrument that they used that is called a gad, G-A-D. It's pretty much a iron bar with an acute ending that they would place in contact on the face of the rock that they're working, and then they would hit it with a hammer so that they would break out a flake, and then they would rinse and repeat until they would have removed enough material to either extract the ore or continue the creation of a gallery. Imagine doing that. It's a lot of work. We read that baskets of esparto grass waterproofed with pitch and bronze or wooden buckets have been found in the mines. Now here's when the situation gets interesting. We are getting close to the plot twist that I was about to tell you, which is the whole reason why I even brought up the idea of the mines underneath the pyramids in the first place. When it comes to Egypt, we read, from the 1st century AD, Roman miners had access to 2 water lifting devices. The earlier one is the Archimedean screw. This one, the earliest one. Diodorus describes the use of the screw. Check this out. Open quotes. They draw off the streams of water with the so-called Egyptian screw, which Archimedes the Syracusan invented when he visited Egypt. By means of these devices, set up in an unbroken series up to the mouth of the mine, they dry up the mining area and provide a suitable environment for carrying out their work. Since this device is quite ingenious, a prodigious amount of water is discharged from the depth into the light of day. Close quotes. So, next they're going to tell us about Vitruvius and other types of mechanical devices that the ancients used. But what's interesting about this, which once again kind of lifts up the validity of the theory or hypothesis that I had proposed, in fact I shouldn't call it a theory, with the idea that these could be mines underneath the pyramids of Giza, is that we are told that this entire invention that the Greeks used before the Romans, so this is even more ancient, they got it from the Egyptians. Archimedes invented it when he visited Egypt, which very likely what that means is that he copied it from the Egyptians. The Egyptians had invented a specific type of screw that they can use to take care of exactly this one problem that they would have encountered if they were trying to create mining shafts in the limestone underneath the pyramids of Giza, because they would run, as you correctly stated, in that water table. Egyptian screw. Plot twist indeed. Maybe my idea wasn't so stupid after all. Now, when it comes to overcoming the problem of lighting, yes, the miners would have had to spend some time, at least in the dark, but even though they couldn't bring torches with them or live fire, they did have oil lamps. And in fact, these would be the exact same oil lamps that they would be using in Roman homes. And not only we've got proof that Romans used specifically these oil lamps inside the deep mines underneath the ground, as the sources tell us, but Pliny mentions that the consumption of these oil lamps also marked their shifts. This is how common they were. And just to imagine, these would be basically dishes made of terracotta with a wick. Now, just to get even more fascinating, Diodorus is the one that mentions that sometimes these oil lamps would be mounted on the miners' heads. So, it's basically the ancient Roman version of modern mining with the little torch on the helmet. Mind-blowing. Ventilation and bad air is something that the Romans were absolutely aware of. We know that Pliny tells us that as you review the data, it is quite clear that the ancients absolutely were aware of the dangers of both poor ventilation and bad air. In fact, even the fumes that come from the furnaces were something that they knew could be toxic and damaging to both animals and humans. Remember, they don't have access to modern medicine, they may not understand genetics, biology in the same way we do, but they are keen observers, and there is a lot that you can determine and figure out with accumulated generational knowledge when you simply look at cause and effect. Strabo, Lucretius and Vitruvius mention this problem, and in fact it is the latter that tells us how they fixed it. One of the things they did first to sort of assess to see if they were going so deep that the air started to become dangerous was to lower a lamp inside to determine it and observe if there was an airflow sufficient for human survival. And this is where we get into the ingenuity of the ancients, both the Romans and the Greeks, and in my opinion even the Egyptians at this point. What we know that the Romans did is that they created artificial ventilation. So how would they achieve this? Theophrastus is the author that helps us understand how they thinned the air. So what they did is that, as you know, we just said that they would create these shafts, but then they would cut in the ground right next to it in parallel smaller shafts. And these were used so that as they were working, the warmer air will be pushed up and then replaced by colder, cooler and more breathable air. We read, "But if the flame is snuffed out by the power of the gas, then ventilation shafts are to be dug next to the well on either side. In this way the gas vapors will be dissipated through the shaft as through nostrils." Pliny even refers to a wavy linen strip. And as the article here suggests, we are told that Pliny even refers to linen strips that were used to create artificial air movement or flow. Temperature was also another massive problem. In fact, we read that for every 30 meters deeper, the temperature increased by 1 degree centigrade. And without having to go deeply into this one, you can imagine how much of this is going to be a problem once you already increase it by 10 degrees as you go down 300 meters in the ground. In fact, this is why oftentimes in iconography, miners are half naked. That's one way to address the problem, but possibly change of shifts might be another one. By reading the sources, one of the main things that you notice is that clearly this, the deep shaft mining, was the least favorite version of ore extraction by both the Romans, the Greeks, and I want to say everyone, because it was dangerous, people would die, time and resources had to be allocated, and of course you had to be very ingenious in order to solve all of the different problems that you would have to deal with. And in fact, I'm going to add one problem on top of all the problems that have been raised by my own community, which I appreciate by the way, since you inspired this entire video. And that is the fact that the materials that you get at greater depth are not exactly the same as the materials you will get above the surface or at very shallow depth or in a very shallow pit. That is because as you reach greater depth, below the oxidized ore zone, the ores you would have extracted would have been sulfide ores, which the Romans of course figured out how to treat, but that would have basically extended the process, made it even more complicated. Now, clearly, in our day and age, we were able to go a lot deeper. I mean, I did misspeak in the previous video and I said 4,000 kilometers. Of course, I meant 4,000 meters, so 4 kilometers underground. But we do have a lot of mines where, with modern technology, we can still overcome a lot of these problems which continue to pile up and become even more of a problem, even more of an issue as we dig deeper in the mines. But think about it this way. If watching this video with the information I've shared, which was a very surface level discussion on ancient mining, if the information I presented already surprised you, and there were quite a few things that, gosh, you did not know that the ancients were capable of doing, and in fact, you had no idea that people in antiquity were even capable of thinking this way, then who knows? Maybe, and only maybe, if we were to find other mines, maybe not underneath Giza, but in other places throughout the world, perhaps we will be surprised the same way, or maybe 2 times fold, when we figure out just how ingenious the ancients were. Which is why I'm still gonna pencil it in, my hypothesis. Alright, number ones, but I hope that you found this one informative and interesting. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you tomorrow for my next daily upload. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much.